am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Just notice the emphasis. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Turn to John chapter 17 if you would, and verse number 15. John 17:15, Jesus says, I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from the evil. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Verse 17, sanctify them. What's going to accomplish the stated goal here in verses 15 and 16? Sanctify them through thy truth. Amen. Thy word is truth. It appears that the world has gone crazy. I'm going to make the case this morning that it's not crazy. That many of the seemingly ridiculous things that people believe nowadays are perfectly logical from a certain assumption. The foundational assumptions of our culture are shifting, and they're changing in very dramatic ways that are actually unprecedented in human history. And I believe there's a case for that can be documented. And that's kind of what I want to talk about this morning. But when you think about whether it's transgender issues or LGBTQ ideology, just the rampant rejection of traditional belief, radical politics, subjective views of truth, pluralism, etc., all of these things present our churches with very difficult challenges. And although any attempt to explain these things through a singular factor, with a singular factor, is destined to be incomplete, I do believe and am convinced that the rise of postmodern thinking is a cultural tsunami engulfing all ways of life, from politics, school policy, and even theology. In fact, there is a church movement, a growing church movement in America that you may have heard of called the emerging church that is adjusting its theology to our postmodern culture. So the question is, what is postmodernism and why is it important for us to become familiar with it? And really the goal of this is in explaining the emerging church and postmodernism to give us an explanatory power to understand some of what's going on in the world. All of these crazy, insane beliefs. This morning, my goal is to give us a box to kind of put all these things in. And they can be sorted later into smaller groups, but a lot of what's happening in our culture is a result of this shift towards something called postmodernism. And so we'll pray, and then we'll jump in, and we're going to go really fast this morning, so stick with me. Let's pray. Lord, we love you. We thank you for this day. Thank you for the beautiful weather. And Lord, just am so thankful for your word. Thank you for these men and ladies who are gathered here. Lord, bless me, fill me with your spirit. I need your help. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to split the study up this morning into two sections. We're going to talk about the emerging church, then we're going to talk about postmodernism and how they're related. You should have received a resource list, and this is for later. We're not going to consult this. But on your resource list, you'll find 5 different resources I found very helpful. Becoming Conversant with the Emerging Church by D.A. Carson. Some of you might be familiar with this name. A book called Listening to the Beliefs of Emerging Churches. So the first book there is kind of a critique of the emerging church. The second one is them in their own words, which was very, very helpful. And each chapter at the end has responses by the other authors to the author's premise in the chapter. It's very, very helpful, and you're hearing it straight from the horse's mouth. There's a great article we're going to reference extensively this morning, A Pastoral Perspective on the Emerging Church by Mark Driscoll. Some of you probably know that name as well. The reason that we're consulting him is because he was one of the initial founders or influences in the emerging movement, so he's a good resource there. These two I really want to recommend to you. Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen R.C. Hicks. It is a heavy book. It's a difficult book. I have read it multiple times, gone back and highlighted. It's a work of academia. It was one of his thesis papers in his academic work, but it's very, very helpful. But if you could just read one, if you could only read one of these, read The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl R. Trueman. I've been hoping in my study of these things over the past few years that a book like this existed, and it does. and I came across it thankfully, just luckily came across it. I recommend that book very, very highly to you to explain kind of what's going on. So let's begin by talking about the emerging church. The emerging church is difficult to define, and they prefer it that way. They like that. But it would be best understood as a movement. It's a cultural and theological shift within Christianity that began around the year 2000 and is affecting churches and believers everywhere. The ideological roots of this movement go back to Europe, as it seems like most bad things do, to Europe in the 1970s. It's not a formal denomination, and its thought leaders vary greatly in practice and doctrine. Some are very conservative theologically, and their changes in their church, their adaptation to postmodern culture is mostly practical. And then on the very liberal side, you have wholesale changes to doctrine. Brian McLaren, Doug Paget are two good examples of those more liberal type thinkers. But what makes them emergent or emerging, you can use those terms simultaneously, is their adaptation to postmodern culture. That's what the emerging church is trying to do. So here's the definition. This is on your resource list. You can have this for later. How do we define the emerging church? What is it? The emerging church is a movement that is taken note of the cultural shift towards a postmodern, neo-pagan, non-Christian culture and seeks to adapt to it in an attempt to keep the church relevant. That's what's happening. Now, how did this come about? So we're going to go to Mark Driscoll for this. He's pastor of Trinity Church in Arizona. If you know about him, you probably know he was a pastor in Seattle, Mars Hill, a mega church. And he was one of the initial influences in the emerging church when it first came to be. And in 2006, he wrote an article entitled A Pastoral Perspective on the Emerging Church, explaining how it came to be and why he parted ways with some of its leading influences. So Driscoll explains that in the mid-1990s, a group of pastors began discussing this cultural shift from modernism to postmodernism, and were asking themselves, what do we do about it? And in the beginning, a lot of the changes were practical in nature. How do we change our leadership structure? How do we change our worship services? Things like that. But eventually, the changes got more and more dramatic and began to affect theology. Now, before we get that far, Driscoll kind of breaks down what has happened in specifically America over the past many years, how the church has changed. He kind of splits it up, and forgive me for using that word church very broadly. You understand why I'm saying it like that. But he breaks up church history, let's say, in America into three different categories. You have church 1.0, church 2.0, and church 3.0. So Driscoll's case is that we are currently shifting from church 2.0 to church 3.0 as the dominant strain of Christianity in America. Now, what is church 1.0? Well, it's your church. It's my church. It's this church. And he says that the church 1.0 is traditional, institutional, and can be described in these ways. The cultural context is modern. So we are a traditional, institutional church in a modern culture. The church holds a privileged place in the larger culture. People respect the institution of the church. They think church is a good thing. Pastors are teachers who lead people by virtue of their spiritual authority. Church services are marked by choirs, robes, hymnals, and organs. This is all Driscoll. Missions involve sending Americans and dollars overseas through denominations and mission agencies. So that's his description of what we might consider to be the traditional church, church 1.0. All right, well, church 2.0, he says, began to replace church 1.0 as the dominant church in the Western world. So what's different about that? Church 2.0, the cultural context there is in transition from a modernist culture to a postmodern culture. And there's a culture war going on to regain a lost position of privilege in the culture. That's no surprise to us. We're all well aware that there's many people who don't esteem church the way that they used to. And I don't just mean attendance, but the institution itself. Right. They don't value the institution. The culture has changed in that way. Pastors are more like CEOs, running businesses that market spiritual goods and services to customers. Churches use pop culture, contemporary music, and drama in an effort to attract non-Christians. And missions is a department of the church that organizes overseas trips and funding. So that's Church 2.0. And that is now the dominant kind of church in America today. I think we'd all agree on that. Driscoll's case is that we are shifting from Church 2.0 to Church 3.0. Church 3.0 is trying to, and in fact there are many that would fall in that second category, Church 2.0. I'll give an example later of a name that you're familiar with, who you can tell, well, it's usually you see it first in practice, you see it in leadership structures or the church itself, and then eventually it starts to impact doctrine. And we're starting to see that even in some of these established Church 2.0 type churches. So what is Church 3.0? This is his definition. Church 3.0 is emerging. Missional is another word that you would listen out for. And marked by the following traits. The cultural context is postmodern and pluralistic. The church accepts that it's marginalized in the culture. Pastors consider themselves to be local missionaries. Church services blend ancient forms and local styles. And missions is, and this is their word, global, meaning global and local. So that's Church 3.0. Now, Driscoll explains that over time, this gang disbanded for a variety of reasons. But the reason why Driscoll left the group was, quote, theological differences with men such as Brian McLaren. So initially it was, hey, let's change our leadership structures. Let's change our services. What can we do to entice non-Christians to come to our church? But then the more that they began to talk and get to know each other, some of those guys wanted to take it even further than that and say, no, we need to change our doctrine. Yes. We need to change our theology. Right. Now, it is in these theological concerns where the primary danger of the movement lies. Now, a word of clarification. Not all emerging churches are changing their doctrine. Driscoll cites Dr. Ed Stetzer. Some of you might know that name. He's the editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine, also an expert in missions. So he studied the emerging movement and broke the movement down into three groups. He describes them as relevants, reconstructionists, and revisionists. So relevance, the first group, would be emerging leaders who are changing the way they do church to appeal to postmodern culture. So these changes are largely practical in nature. They are usually very conservative theologically, but examples would be music or leadership structure. The second group he labels reconstructionists, and these are also most of the time conservative in their theology, but they're more willing to radically change the way that they do church. And an example of this would be an emphasis on home churches, which definitely does seem, we have that in our area as well, a growing emphasis on having church at home. They propose more informal and incarnational, as their word, organic church forms. So these two groups are the least concerning of the three, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them, but we are very concerned about the reconstructionists, the third category. We'll get to that in a second. So I want to go into a little bit about exactly what some of these changes are that they're making, because they're interesting. It's just interesting to note. This might help us identify it when we see it. So this section, if you're taking notes, we might call practical emergence. Practical emergence. This practical adaptation to postmodern culture takes many forms. I'll get 10 different examples here, but we mentioned this already. Home church instead of a place of worship. An emphasis on communal living. There's definitely an anti-prosperity gospel element to the emerging church. We'll talk about that in a second, which we would agree on. But number 3, changing the Christian vocabulary to accommodate non-Christians. Number 4, church services adapt to local customs. The church takes on the personality of their immediate culture. Number 5, a wide range of worship music. Number 6, an emphasis on the appreciation of the arts. I have a theory on why that is. I think it's just because the types of personalities who would be interested in this type of a movement tend to be liberal people in personality, and it's that type of personality that tends to appreciate art. Does that make sense? That's my working theory on why that seems to be a common denominator. I think that is reflective of the personality types that are influences within this movement, more so than it is some type of objective, wonderful thing that they all decided to do. Number 7, narrative style preaching in place of expository preaching. There's a very important reason for that. I'm not going to necessarily make that connection, but that's exactly the conclusion you would make if you bought into postmodernism. Number 8, an emphasis on social justice. Number 9, transformation of the worship space into a multi-use area that includes things like journaling stations. Now, that's a little quirky, not sinful, not wrong. I mean, you guys, some of you are journaling right now. But that's not necessarily wrong. It is different, but it just shows a different mindset. Number 10, incorporating ancient practices. One example is like the lighting of candles. You actually find that I was surprised reading Carson's book how many times he mentioned candles. Use candles, use candles, use candles, use candles. I thought that's very strange. It's like, is this a candle racket? You know, is that actually what it is? It's a front for a candle company. It's really Bed Bath & Beyond that's pushing this. You know? But, so here's a question we need to ask. So why the dramatic shift in practice? Why? Why? The church has been overhauled before. We understand that, right? Why are we doing it now? What's the impetus for this? Carson says that one of the things that defines the emerging church is protest. Protest. You might be surprised to find, I was, that most of the big movers and shakers in the emerging movement come from traditional conservative churches with a fundamentalist tilt. That's where they're sourcing their thought leaders. So a question that we have to come to grips with, especially if we're involved with a college, for example, is where are these young men going? So when they leave more conservative type churches, where are they going? They're going a lot of places, but this is one of the places that they're going. And one of the things that they're doing, you think about a guy like Brian McLaren, is what he believes now versus what he believed then could not be more different.
Right.
Yeah. It borders on, I say borders, that's generous. Some of it is heresy.
Right.
It is flat out heresy. Now, Carson says that many of these individuals became disillusioned with the absolutism of fundamentalist churches. And there's a desire to go from, quote, absolute to authentic. Absolute to authentic. You hear an authentic relationship with Jesus Christ, which agreed. But what do you mean by that? And what are you replacing? What are you replacing to get this authenticity? What are you sacrificing in an effort? Right? What are you replacing it with? They reject the pastor as CEO culture, and this is a place where we'd stand on common ground, I think, that has risen in many megachurches, and there's in general, an anti-megachurch sentiment within the emerging church. They're very happy to be a small church. Very, very happy to be a small church. But the emerging church, in short, the change in practice and emphasis is a reaction to alleged abuses in the modern church. That's basically what is happening. So these changes are quirky, and some of them are strange. Some of them, are fine, we might say. But it's not what they're changing from necessarily that's the issue. It's what they're changing into theologically, that's the issue. And while they deserve credit for correctly observing many of the mistakes that the modern church has made, such as the mega culture, which is definitely a problem, a lack of authenticity, we agree on that, the prosperity gospel, pastoral abuses of authority, it's not, again, what they're changing from, it's what they're changing into. And the primary issue with the emerging church is that these practical changes are fundamentally an acquiescence to postmodern culture. So that's what's happening, is the impetus for it is, oh my goodness, the culture is changing radically, so we must also change radically. It's good observation, bad conclusion. And this practical change is nestled within an even bigger epistemological change. So now we come to the third group within the emerging church that Dr. Stetzer calls the revisionists, easy for me to say. So revisionists are theologically liberal, and they question key evangelical doctrines. This is Driscoll's quote, critiquing their appropriateness for the emerging postmodern world. They look to leaders such as Brian McLaren and Doug Paget. The common critique of this type, Stetzer says, is that they are simply recycling the doctrinal debates of previous generations. Okay, so what are these doctrinal debates that they are getting back into? What are the issues that they're wrestling with and trying to adapt to postmodern culture? Are you ready? Driscoll gives us 8. Number 1, Scripture. This includes divine inspiration, perfection, and the authority of Scripture. Number 2, Jesus Christ. This includes his deity and sovereignty. Number 3, gender. This includes whether or not people are created with inherent gender differences, whether or not those gender roles have any implication for the governments of home and church, and whether or not homosexual practice is sinful. This also includes whether or not it is appropriate to use gender-specific names for God, such as Father, like Jesus did. So should we agree with Ariana Grande that God is a woman? Should we agree with that? I like what C.S. Lewis said, just a brief explanation. He said, God should be described in masculine terms because all things in relation to God are feminine. I'll let that soak in for a while. That's pretty good. Number 4, sin. The primary issue here is whether or not human beings are conceived as sinners or are essentially morally neutral and are internally corrupted solely by external forces. So that's the basic assumption of our culture now, right? You ever heard the statement, racism could be wiped out in a generation? What's the vehicle that it could be wiped out with under this hypothesis? Education. So if we just educated people properly, there would be no racism. That's a very naive understanding of human nature. That the only thing that's wrong with us are the external social constructs around us. And if we were all left alone and left natural, which you can go read The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. There's always an appeal to nature, appeal to the natural. We have to go back to what is natural. And if we all just grew up wild and free, we'd all be morally perfect. That's the idea. It's literally the idea. It's very naive. Number 5, salvation. The issue is whether or not Jesus is necessary for salvation, and whether or not salvation exists for people in other religions who do not worship Jesus. I read Doug Paget in the book Listening to the Beliefs of Emerging Churches say that although Jesus is the way of salvation for Christians, he can't say what God does for people of other religions. Number 6, the cross. The issue here is the doctrine of penal substitution and whether or not Jesus died in our place for our sins, or if he went to the cross solely as an example for us to follow when we suffer. Number 7, hell. The issue is whether or not anyone will experience conscious eternal torment, or if unbelievers will simply cease to exist. That's annihilationism, or eventually be saved and taken to heaven, universalism. Number 8, authority. The inherent flaw, we'll talk about this in just a second, the inherent flaw of postmodernism, Driscoll says, is becoming a practical obstacle to unity because there's no source of authority to determine what constitutes orthodox or heretical doctrine. He says the authority of Scripture is open for debate. The issue of authority, he says, has very practical implications for the church and home. The result is an ever-growing debate over whether men should lead their homes, pastors should lead their churches, who has the right to preach, teach, or exercise discipline in the church. Now, you can say, I was very surprised when I taught this to our church. I expressed this concern to multiple people. I said, my concern is in teaching this, people will go, wow, that's crazy. Glad I don't know anybody like that. Glad we don't have that problem. Thanks for that. Have a great day. But it wasn't that way. It was, my sister's in a church like that. Oh my goodness, that's my coworkers. That's how they talk. So I underestimated its influence here locally amongst our family members. Now the question might be, why is that? You don't see the first emerging church in downtown Flowery Branch, but the emergent influence is everywhere. You can hear it in many pulpits today, such as Andy Stanley. So Andy Stanley said this in a now deleted tweet. Some of you probably heard about this. He said, the Christian faith doesn't rise and fall on the accuracy of 66 ancient documents. It rises and falls on the identity of a single individual, Jesus of Nazareth. There's just one problem with that, which is the only reason we know the identity of Jesus of Nazareth is because of 66 ancient documents. Other than that, he's good. Other than that, he's 100% right. But that is the emerging mindset. We substitute the objective truth, the absolute nature of the scriptures, and we replace it with personal experience. This isn't about a knowledge of the truth, because the truth actually can't be obtained. This is about your individual relationship with, insert nebulous term here, God. Jesus. Who is Jesus? He's whatever you experience him to be, in a way, is actually the conclusion of this. They would never say that. And they tell the same stories that we tell, and they preach about the cross, but it's like, what do you mean by that? Some of it's very subtle. So, why the change? What is the philosophical foundation for this shift? So let's recap. The emerging church is a movement that has noticed the cultural shift towards postmodernism and is adapting in practice, and in some cases doctrinally, in an effort to keep the church relevant. Now, you've heard the term postmodernism many times already, and in order to understand why the emerging church is doing this, we have to define that term and understand what it is, understand how postmodernism is affecting our culture. All right, so here's maybe a thesis statement. The Western world is undergoing a major epistemological shift that is upending some of our most basic understandings, including gender, sexuality, the role of government, or even the most important one in my mind is what it means to be a person. What does it mean to be a person? Now, this next section we're going to call epistemological emergence. Epistemological emergence. What do we mean by that? An epistemology, and listen to me, an epistemology is a theory of knowledge, especially regarding its methods, validity, and scope. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. Does that make sense? So, like, you could come up with an epistemology right now. You could say, I believe that truth is only obtained through dreams and visions. That's your epistemology. It's a theory of knowing. How is knowledge acquired? My definition would be, an epistemology is how a culture or a person defines truth and how they believe it's obtained. That's my definition of epistemology. The emerging church is a part of a larger paradigm shift in the Western world as it relates to our conception of truth. And D.A. Carson and Stephen Hicks is the expert here. Stephen Hicks was identifying and working on postmodernism a long time before most academics in the United States had even taken notice of it. Most academics, when they started to hear about postmodernism, they said things like, man, that's crazy, like, who would believe that? And they went back to work. But it began to spread, first in the humanities in the 1950s. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But Hicks and Carson both really help us to conceptualize the changing understanding of truth in the Western world across time by breaking it down into three categories. Okay? So we talked about postmodernism. Well, that implies that there's a modernism, and you're probably very familiar with that. But then before that, what is before modernism? We're just going to call it pre-modernism. So we have pre-modernism, modernism, and postmodernism. Now, what does that mean? So let's start with pre-modernism. What was the cultural conception of truth and how it's to be obtained before the arrival of modernism out of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries? Okay, so what was going on before that? Before the Enlightenment, truth was understood as objective. And what does that mean? It means not influenced by personal feelings or opinion. Do you understand what that means? So that means that what's true is not influenced by how or what you think about what is true, right? That's the pre-modern conception and the modern conception of truth, that it's objective. Truth is outside of you. It's not contained, it's not individualized, it's outside of you. It's something that you can have, but you have to have a mechanism to get you to the truth. So what was the mechanism under pre-modernism whereby the truth was obtained? Well, in a word, it was faith. It was faith. So how did the pre-modern world understand how truth was acquired? They understood that it was objective and available. It was knowable. It was available to man, listen to me, on the basis of the existence of God and the revelation of himself, of himself through the Bible. That's the pre-modern conception of how truth was obtained. So in short, we would say, in the pre-modern context, God is the final arbiter of truth.
Right. Amen.
Under the pre-modern assumption, God was the final arbiter of truth. So in regards to a Bible verse or passage, for example, if you handed it to someone who was just explicitly postmodern and you said, is this true? They wouldn't even have to look at it. They'd say, yes, that's true. And you say, why is that true? They say, well, because it's in the Bible. And God revealed himself to us through his word. That was their beginning assumption, that the Bible was true and God revealed himself to us through his word. All right, that changed under modernism. That changed as a result of the Enlightenment. As a result of the Enlightenment, the authority of God and his word was replaced with the authority of what? Human reason and rationality. If something was considered irrational, the higher critics would place miracles in this category. You think about David Hume and his skepticism, Immanuel Kant and others. It must be rejected as untrue. So in the end, all supernaturalism is rejected by modernism. True modernism rejects all miracles and all supernaturalism in the Bible. Well, that's a problem, because if you let modernism get a hold of the Bible, what happens to it? It ceases to be what it's understood to be by all of its believers and practitioners. So the modernist conception of truth is that human reason is the final arbiter of truth. So we read the Bible, and you would hand them a Bible verse, and you say, is this true? And they say, well, hold on a second, let me look at it. Let me see if that can be empirically verified. Let me check my sources. Okay, what about Genesis 1? Well, what does Darwin have to say? So, we have natural selection. How are we going to fit that into Genesis 1? What are we going to do about that? And if we can prove something by law, if we can use that, okay, well, then we got to get rid of Genesis 1. We have to adapt our understanding of Genesis 1 to something that is empirically verified, right? That's modernism. Now, it is really, really, really important that we understand and appreciate how long it takes for these epistemological changes to hit the church. So think about this. These thoughts originated in the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th centuries, primarily France. But when did the cultural battle in America, the church battle against modernism, really begin? The early 20th century. That's a long time, friends. A long time. And a similar thing is happening now. What we have happening now is a 200 or 400-year-old sized domino is hitting the earth, and we're living in the dust going, what in the world is going on? Oh my word, everyone's going crazy. No, that's not what's happening. This thinking has been in the works for a very, 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 very long time. You go all the way back to the Enlightenment itself. In the Enlightenment, there was a counter-Enlightenment in Germany that sprung out some of these thoughts that we're going to talk about here in a moment. The roots of postmodernism, which is quickly becoming one of the fundamental assumptions of our culture, goes all the way back as well to the 17th and 18th centuries. So the battle that we had in the church here in America in the early 1900s against modernism, you're all well aware of that. What was that? Well, modernism began to threaten the doctrines of the church. So what happened? Well, many pastors understood, well, what happens if we let modernism get a hold of the virgin birth? What happens? We lose the virgin birth. Wait a second, if we lose the virgin birth, we lose everything. What happens to the deity of Christ? What happens to miracles? What happens to all these things if we say, well, we only believe what can be empirically verified by human reason? Only that which is reasonable, only that which is rational. All right, so many people began to codify our beliefs, to explain our beliefs, to defend our beliefs subject by subject. These were compiled by a man named R.A. Torrey in a famous volume called The Fundamentals. So this church and your churches are living legacies of that battle. You would not call yourself what you do had those men not understood what was happening in the culture. And although it hit the church very, very late, by that time, it had already been absorbed into the broad social culture. The culture had already accepted the premise of modernism a long time before it hit the church. Things hit the church last. We're the last line of defense, so to speak. And what's happening now is, you say, man, some of this is unfamiliar. It's like, no, it's not unfamiliar. You just know it in political terminology. We're very concerned about what's happening in the world politically. It's like, it doesn't stop with the politics. It's not just LGBTQ for them, or transgender for them, or what Truman calls expressive individualism, or we're living in the age of the psychological man, where everything is psychological. It's whatever you think. Truth is individualized, right? That's coming here. It's already here. The emerging church is proof of that, because you have a major movement in America saying we have to adapt or we're going to die. We have to adapt to postmodernism, this epistemology, or we're not going to make it. Now, so we have premodernism. God is the final arbiter of truth. We have modernism. Human reason is the final arbiter of truth. So what is postmodernism? We are living in a time of a seismic shift in the way that truth is understood. Postmodernism, like the emerging church, is difficult to define, but it helps to remember that it's an epistemology. It's a theory of knowledge. How does postmodern culture believe truth is obtained? What do they believe about truth? Okay. Postmodernism claims that the personal experience of the individual is the final arbiter of truth. Postmodernism claims that the personal experience of the individual is the primary and final arbiter of truth, which of course destroys truth as a category. Now, how is that possible? We can say, that's crazy. It's not crazy. It's not crazy. It's perfectly logical if you begin from the wrong assumption. Right. We understand that reason and logic do not discriminate. They start wherever you do. If you start from the assumption, for example, which our culture has soaked up, that human beings are just merely advanced primates, and you reason your way forward from that, you can come to all types of what we might say are crazy conclusions. Not crazy, reasonable from the wrong assumption. The assumptions of our culture are changing, and we have to take notice of this. So how does postmodernism get to say that personal experience and not human reason or not God or faith is the final arbiter of truth? The way that they do this, the way to understand this is, postmodernism is essentially a critique of human reason. And it's a protest against the conclusions of the Enlightenment. So postmodernism says, no, wait a second. Human reason is not the final arbiter of truth for the following reasons. Postmodernism claims that human reason is not sufficient to help us arrive at the knowledge of what is actually true. So they say, wait a second, we cannot arrive at some knowledge of this objective universal truth using human reason because human reason is flawed. All right, so they do this with two arguments. So they say there's two problems with human reason that make it incapable for us to be able to obtain truth by it. Are you ready? You still with me? They say human reason is limited, which we would agree with. Number two, they say human reason is not universal. People reason different ways. There is not a universal capital R reason that we all reason inside of. You reason your way, and you reason your way, and you reason your way, and I reason my way. And different cultures reason different ways. Now, let's talk about each of these. So firstly, postmodernism says, wait a second, we can't know what modernism says that we think we can know. For example, I was talking with an atheist one time here under our portico. He came to church one morning, and he said, well, everything is knowable. Everything is knowable. That's modernism. We can reason our way to the knowledge of all truth. Everything is knowable. I said, sir, how do you know that? How do you know that everything is knowable? Do you know that everything is knowable, or is that a statement of faith, not a statement of fact? Can that statement be empirically verified? And if not, shouldn't we reject it? You know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know. And you don't know what you know that you actually think you know, but you don't know. But the modernist assumption is that everything is knowable. Postmodernism says, nope, we can't know anything for sure. Why? Human reason is limited. Well, how is it limited? They say that human reason is limited in its ability. We can only know so much. So an example would be postmodern thinking applied to a Bible interpretation. So tell me if this sounds familiar. Would be, well, there's an infinite number of interpretations. So therefore, you can't determine which one is true or even best. And even if you attempted to, the second critique, that opinion is so biased by your culture and by your upbringing and by your way of knowing, you can't expect other people to all think and know the same way that you think and know. Or we might sum it up and just say, that's just your what? Interpretation. So why does that statement carry any weight? Because what, I believe this guy Philip Reef in the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, he talks about something called the social imaginary. The idea is that people are not familiar with the term postmodernism. They're not familiar with it. And even if they are, they can't define it. But the idea has been soaked up by our culture. Like Darwinism. How many people are qualified, biologically speaking, to actually give us a good explanation of what natural selection is? And yet it's one of the basic assumptions that everybody works off of. That's the idea of the social imaginary. So this is soaking up into the social imaginary, and the proof of that is you have people saying to you, well, that's just your interpretation. It's like, what does that even mean? What do you mean that's just my interpretation? What they mean is there's an infinite number of possible interpretations, and how could you expect human reason to be able to navigate an infinitude? You understand? An infinitude can't be navigated, can it? It can't be traversed. You can't break it down into bits and get a hold of one of the bits and say, God, this is it. Nope, can't do that. God is a simple being, right? He's an infinite being. You can't break him down into parts. Okay, the postmodern critique of human reason is human reason cannot navigate an infinite amount of facts. If facts are infinite, there's no way for you to figure out which one's the right one. How could you? You can't. It's impossible. It's interesting. Hicks says this, postmodern literary criticism rejects the notion that literary texts have objective meanings and true interpretations. So when you read a text, it's not about understanding what it means objectively. It's about your personal experience of the information. And you can interpret however you want. D.A. Carson rightly points out that if postmodernism is correct in its critique of modernism, then to know the truth, you have to be omniscient. That's the idea. So their claim is, well, you can't know anything for sure because there's an infinite number of things to know, and the only way you can know an infinite number of things is to be omniscient. And because you're not, then you can't lay claim to any one fact and say, this is objectively true. Because beyond that fact, there's an infinite number of other facts that you could never become fully acquainted with. You have not compared all of the facts. It's impossible. You don't even know all of the interpretations. And the statistical probability that the one that you cling to and say, this is the right understanding, there's 1 million times a million times a million other ones that you're not aware of. So the chance that you have the right one is 0. Does that make sense? That's the postmodern critique of human reason. So the Bible then, for example, would have an unlimited number of possible interpretations. Here's the consequence, all of them valid. That's the consequence. Is because we cannot discriminate because of the flawed nature of human reason, we have to accept all of them. So we replace truth with tolerance. Why the emphasis on tolerance? Because we can't know the truth. Therefore, you can't arrange facts or information in a hierarchy and say this one's better than that one. You can't do it. So what do you have to do? Stop being so dogmatic and be tolerant. Be tolerant of all viewpoints. They're all valid. So number 2, postmodernism also claims that reason is influenced by our culture or our upbringing, our assumptions, and therefore it's innately biased, making the rational pursuit of truth untenable. This is very important. Postmodernism denies that human reason or even human nature is universal. They do not believe in a universal human nature. What does that mean? That cultures aren't just different in practice, their nature is different. Their human nature is fundamentally different. So your way of knowing and my way of knowing are not both a product of the same capital R reason, but yours is a process of your social construction, and mine is a product of my social construction. So you have been created. Your human nature is malleable. It changes across time. And there's even broad scholarship on this issue. There's a lady, I think feminine studies at one of the big universities, who her life's work is explaining how she believes human nature, specifically female human nature, has changed over time. That's what they believe. Okay, well, if that's true, if human nature is not fixed, which is the pre-modern assumption and the modern assumption, right? The pre-modern assumption is humans are humans. People are people. And reason works the same way for you that it does for me. And we may talk different. We may arrange facts a little differently, but we all reason lowercase r inside of reason uppercase r. Does that make sense? Postmodernism says, nope, human nature is not universal. So, in other words, both the pre-modern and modernist assumption is that reason is reason for everyone. Every human has the same nature, and although cultural expression varies greatly, the same human nature undergirds all people. Postmodernism denies this and views human nature as a product of social construction. Therefore, reason cannot be universal, and neither can morals or understandings of truth. If your nature is fundamentally different from mine, how can I say that my morality applies to you? And how can I critique your morality? You reasoned your way to that fundamentally different than I did. They're removing the basis for the criticism of morality. Does that make sense? So then what do? Well, you have to tolerate everything. People don't believe what they do under postmodernism because their views agree with a universal reason or logic, but because they are, for example, a straight white American male living in the 21st century. Well, the only reason you believe that is because you are fill in the blank. And we say, that's crazy. No, this is objectively true. They're like, nothing's objectively true. What are you talking about? There's an infinite number of facts. You can't traverse all of that. Human reason is limited. And the only reason you reason the way that you do is because you're a straight white American male who lives in the 21st century. So how can you criticize someone else who lives on the other side of the globe with a different culture, a different heritage, a different way of knowing? You can't criticize them. So therefore, because of postmodernism's belief in the unattainability of capital T truth, truth as a category is replaced with what Carson calls the postmodernist trinity of values, which is tolerance, talked about that, pluralism, and a relative view of morality. So we lose truth, and we experience the world through our individual experience, and that's how we have truth for us, and we can't criticize anybody else's conception of truth because human nature is not universal. Okay, so where did this thought come from, quickly? Postmodernism has remained largely in the margins of academia in America until the 1950s, so recently. Its core tenets are, as explained by Stephen Hicks, in metaphysics. Instead of the supernaturalism of premodernism or the naturalism of modernism, we have anti-realism under postmodernism. What does that mean? That means they believe there is no reality outside of human experience. Premoderns and modernists all agree that the world exists as such, that the world objectively exists. Postmodernists do not believe that. They deny an objective external reality. Postmodernism rejects this and says there's no reality outside of human nature. So this helps us understand why someone can say, I am a man in a woman's body, and our culture goes, we're cool with that. On what basis? And the modernists say, which some of us, we chirp the modernist line, is, but biology. But biology. Is biology a truth category? Then the postmodernists would reject it and say, wait a second, science is based on reason, and reason is flawed. So you can't make universal biological claims. And my personal experience transcends the biological fact. That's the idea. All right, in epistemology, instead of the faith of the pre-modern world or the reason of the modernist world, we have social subjectivism. So there's no objective truths or moral values. All things are relative and subjective, and Dr. Miller is going to help us on that here in a moment. All of this, the epistemology, is helpfully summarized through the quippy phrase, my truth. My truth. What is that? Well, if there's no objective truth, there is only individualized subjective truth. And the way that you know things is through living out your personal experience. in the world. Human nature. Instead of original sin or individual autonomy, we have social constructs and conflict. So human nature is not universal, but socially constructed. In ethics, instead of the altruism of pre-modern times, which is the selfless concern for others, or the individualism of modernism, we have egalitarianism. Under politics and economics, instead of feudalism or liberal capitalism, we have socialism. The logical conclusion of postmodernism is Marxism. Why is Marxism on the rise? What is happening? Makes no sense. It's failed everywhere it goes. Doesn't matter when you accept the postmodern epistemology. When you accept the premise of postmodernism, the, ironically, logical conclusion of that is Marxism. So, no one would deny that we are dealing with subjective views of morality, that that's rampant, but few seem to understand why that is. It's not obvious or self-evident. It's not that people are crazy. That's an uneducated cop-out. That's an uneducated cop-out. They are not crazy. They're perfectly logical from the wrong assumption. Although most people are probably not familiar with this term, this idea has seeped into our culture. The emerging church took notice of this in the 1990s, which to their credit is very impressive, because even most in academia, where it was spreading, took no notice of it and did not care. Now, quickly in conclusion, how is Christian doctrine impacted by postmodernism? And why should we be concerned about the emerging church's theological adaptation? I'm going to give you three things. Number one, because as D.A. Carson put it, quote, strong postmodernism sacrifices the category of objective truth. And if Christianity is adapted to postmodern thinking, the objective truth claims of Scripture are lost. Right, yeah. And Christianity ceases to be as such. We must make no mistake. The Bible makes objective truth claims. The Bible makes objective truth claims. We read our text earlier when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. That is an exclusive, absolutist, objective claim. Yeah. That is what that is. Postmodernism would turn this exclusive statement into, at best, Jesus is the way for you. Jesus is the way for Christians. And at worst, well, when Jesus says he's the way, what I feel that he meant is, and you can't criticize that. Right. So Carson is right when he says, the Bible and Christianity has always insisted upon the existence of the category of objective truth. The word truth appears 237 times in the Bible. Jesus said that we are sanctified by truth. If we lose the objective nature of truth, we lose Christianity. This is different than the modernist critique. The modernist critique was, wait a second. We can't just accept things, willy-nilly. That's the way maybe they would describe it. No. We have to empirically verify these things. It was a almost, you would say, logical step in the evolution of truth. Although we understand that postmodernists are actually somewhat correct, and that human reason is limited. But the postmodern critique is different than the modern critique. And fundamentalism rose up to fight back against modernism. But I submit to you, modernism is no longer the cultural force that it once was. The primary battle in the culture is not, hey, modernism is so cool. It's postmodernism. It's not, wait a second, we have to reason our way to the truth. It's truth cannot be known. Well, then what do we do with Christianity? Under modernism, we had to defend these attacks empirically. We had to make faith reasonable, right? We had to say, no, here's the case. Look, why do we have answers in Genesis? Why does something like that exist? Because of the modernist critique of Christian evolution, of creation, excuse me. That's why it exists. And that debate's never going away. The modernist critique will never go away. But in the short to medium term future, the primary threat to the church is not modernism, it's postmodernism. And the proof of that is we find ourselves kind of shoulder to shoulder with some modernists right now. We're standing next to some modernists going, these people are nuts, right? It's crazy. Who believes this stuff? Modernists is like, yeah, I know, I kind of wish we were back, when you guys ran things, you know what I mean? Why does a guy like a Dr. Jordan Peterson, if you're familiar with him, who doesn't believe that Christianity is true, and yet him, like Immanuel Kant, believes it's indispensable? Why? Because like Richard Dawkins said many years ago, I fear that in removing Christianity, we will replace it with something far worse. This is it, Richard. This is it. This is what you get. And he's a modernist. So now he's on the bad side. Right? The postmodernists hate guys like him. They hate scientists. They hate science. Why is it that our culture that used to be so science-oriented is now denying scientific realities? Why? Postmodernism. That's why. Because science cannot make objective truth claims if human reason is limited. All right, so number 2. Second reason we should be concerned about this. Because a fundamental claim of Christianity is that God is knowable. You hear me? A fundamental claim of Christianity is that God is knowable through the revelation of divine truth. So if postmodernism is correct in its critique of modernism, then the knowledge of truth requires omniscience. And to give you that argument again, well, there's an infinite number of interpretations. You can't know them all, and even if you tried, that opinion is socially constructed based upon your heritage, based upon your family, based upon your income, based upon your race and ethnicity, your sexuality, all of those things. And your social construct and my social construct aren't compared in order to find truth, because if there's no truth, there's just power. And it's your social construct against my social construct. The question is, who's going to win? Who's going to win? So we just fight. That's what we do. By the way, if postmodernism is true, and you can't reason your way to truth, then what's the purpose of language? Now, the purpose of language, instead of being a vehicle that helps us to understand and define truth, it becomes a rhetorical device. It's a tool that you use to accomplish your desires in the world. That's what language becomes. So then, instead of you having a conversation with a postmodernist, say, well, let's just talk about it and we'll figure out what's true. Postmodernist looks at you and says, wait a second, we can't have truth. Here's what I'm going to do. If you disagree with me, I'm going to call you a racist. Not because you are one. Not because you are one. It doesn't matter. It's immaterial if you are one or not. Language is a rhetorical device to accomplish my goals in the world. So why are politics so divisive? That's why. That's why politics is so divisive. Why can somebody say one thing out of one side of their mouth and something else out of the other side of their mouth, obviously bold-faced lying, and nobody seems to care? This is why. This is why. So what they're saying is that if we can't know everything there is to know about something, then we can't say that any part of it is objectively true. And ironically, that's just not true, it turns out. But just because there are an infinite number of interpretations of a Bible verse, for example, doesn't mean that some aren't better than others. Some are obviously better than others. And it doesn't mean that we can't know anything about anything. If that were true, and here's my argument against that. If that were true, we would expect a wide range of Bible interpretations about the most basic Bible doctrines. And yet that is not what we find. As much as more conservative Baptist people, as we like to think sometimes that everybody else is wrong on the essentials and we're the only ones who are right, that's not Christian history. So there is a broad consensus, and there's a lot of heresy too. There's a broad consensus, what we might call a 2,000-year-long orthodoxy that has prevailed. If postmodernism is true, we should not expect that. If postmodernism is true, we should expect every single interpretation under the sun. That Jesus and the spaghetti monster in the sky are one and the same. We should have all kinds of things like that. Your church, a church in China, should reason way differently than a church in America, and yet the belief is somewhat orthodox. So postmodernism seems to fail in its description of the way the world actually works. So Carson points out that we can speak to things that we know, and when we do, we're not claiming omniscience. So he gives the examples of knowing the sun will rise tomorrow, or knowing the earth will rotate on its axis. Neither of these knowings requires omniscience. But here's my take. Even if postmodernism accurately reflects the limitations of human reason, and the only way we could know anything about anything was to know everything about everything, to be omniscient, would that still preclude the omniscient one from revealing some of his truth to us? I don't think so. There's room in postmodernism, as far as I can tell, for divine revelation. Because if you accept the existence of an omniscient one, even under the postmodern premise, we can still have truth. How? The omniscient one has to reveal truth to us. And it seems like almost then we're back at the pre-modern assumption, which is God becomes the final arbiter of truth. I think that's the window into postmodernism. That's my feeling. I could be wrong on that, and that's just my take. And if I'm wrong, you can blame D.A. Carson. Okay, so. Number 3, moving on. And this is an admonition. Postmodernism should be defended against theologically, not acclimated to. Postmodernism should be defended against theologically, not acclimated to. Paul said, be not conformed to this world. The reductionism and self-refuting nature of postmodernism render it incompatible with Christianity in my estimation. I believe that's true. Although postmodernism makes good observations about the limitations of human reason, it refutes itself by saying there's no category of objective truth. How did we arrive at this conclusion? Oh, that's right, using this faulty thing called human reason. So we reasoned our way to the point where we said human reason is limited, not universal, and doesn't work. It's like, well, that's confusing to me. So there's no truth. Is that an absolute? Because then you have at least one objective truth, which is that there's no objective truth. And if you have one absolute truth, you actually have two. You have the truth itself and the one that says that that's the only one. So now you have 3, and it just goes on and on. So postmodernism is self-refuting and cannot be catered to in doctrine due to its cancerous effect on the category of truth, without which Christianity nor any worldview concerned with truth could exist except via the so-called tolerance of others. Now, I'm done. Preacher asked me, we were sitting at lunch way before the conference, just I guess when it was thought of being held here, and he said, if you could give me 5 topics that you think preachers should become aware of, 5 things that they should be concerned about, what are 5 threats to the church, whatever it was. I said, okay, no problem. Postmodernism, 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 postmodernism. And I believe that. Why is this important? We already know the importance of it, but we know it in political terminology. Postmodernism applied to politics means the destruction of traditional norms, transgender normalization, radical sexuality, and divisive politics. All of these things are an outgrowth of the postmodern ethos. Postmodernism is most easily recognized in politics, but doesn't stop there. Things hit the church last. It took 200 years for modernism to really affect the church. If we understand, here's my admonition, if we understand and appreciate the men who stood against modernism and defended core doctrines from attack like R.A. Torrey, then we must understand that modernism is no longer the cultural threat it once was. There is a new threat to the Christian faith and practice. The battle over hearts and minds, the hearts and minds of men, is happening again, and we need to get ready. I talk to young people sometime, or even younger Christians who are just coming, they say, oh man, I would have loved to be in the time of this preacher or that preacher when he was defending this doctrine and that doctrine. Guess what? It's happening again. This calls for a new scholarship. This calls for a new scholarship. We have to relearn some things. We're going to have to re-explain some things. We're going to have to break some things down and figure some things out that we haven't figured out before. This is not the same battle. It's categorically different. This is just as big as the Enlightenment. I believe it will be more short-lived than the Enlightenment because the movement itself is so volatile. How can you build a 1,000-year empire on the premise that there's no objective truth? I don't think you can. But the emerging church, for example, in its adaptation to postmodernism, could become a dominant strain of Christianity in the next half century. I believe that. And how good churches respond, how we defend the Christian faith against this, I believe determines what happens to our country. Lastly, the Bible says, that phrase, the Bible says, carries less weight in a postmodern world than it even did in a modern one. Facts, figures, and proofs are beginning to fall on deaf ears. Why? The terms of the ideological battle are shifting. In the present and future, we will not only have to defend Christianity against persistent modernist attacks that deny the supernatural, for example, but also against postmodern subjectivism. And let's pray. Father, we love you. We thank you for the day. Thank you for your word. I thank you for truth. Thank you that thy word is truth. And Father, help us and bless the rest of our day. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. We're going to take a quick break here and